Good afternoon. Hello, everybody, again. I think you had some very interesting workshops this afternoon, some very interesting panel sessions, and I do now have the honor to introduce you to a man who hardly needs an introduction. He just landed an hour and a half ago in Brussels. He faced a rush hour between Brussels and Leuven, but he made it here. He's an American cryptographer, he's a computer security and privacy specialist, very successful writer. He's called the security guru by the newspaper The Economist, and I heard here from people all over, well, he's like, you know, the rock star #1 in security, in cyberspace. So here is to talk to us about surveillance and security, Mr. Bruce Schneier.
So thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for putting up with my flight delay at Heathrow. Actually, I was thinking a lot on the way over what to talk about, and I decided I want to talk about cyber conflict, cyber war. I really want to talk about the Sony incident, because the Sony hack from last year, I think, brings into focus a lot of the very complicated issues we have to deal with as individuals, as companies, as governments, as international bodies about cyber attacks and cyber conflict and cyber war, and what it looks like in the 21st century. So I want to give a timeline for the Sony attack, and I'm going to do it in a little bit of detail because I think it's really interesting to look at what happened and when. And a lot of this just was reported sloppily. So I'll start. A couple of preludes, actually two preludes, we learned in an unrelated article about the NSA by Spiegel that in the fall of 2010, there were two code-named NSA operations to penetrate North Korea. Right? So the U.S. has been trying to penetrate North Korean networks. There were two specific things that happened in 2010, and the United States was successful. One of them is what's called a fourth-party attack, and it's kind of interesting. The U.S. was spying on South Korea and getting data, and some of that data was stuff that South Korea was getting from North Korea. So the U.S. was spying on South Korea, spying on North Korea. And that turned out to be a fruitful avenue of attack, and the U.S. got lots of data about North Korea, presumably even more about South Korea, but leave that aside. So that happened as early as 2010, possibly before. The other prelude, in June of 2014, there was an official threat by the U.S. government official threat by the North Korean government against Sony, telling them not to release the interview, the movie that was critical of the North Korean government. And after that, and again, we learned this a lot later, the president of Sony consulted with the U.S. government. The U.S. government said, really don't worry about it. North Korea makes a whole lot of empty threats. Sony concluded there were some risks, and actually, they took their name off the movie. They were going to release the movie, but it wouldn't have the Sony name on it. There was pressure, and we learned this from some of the leaked emails within Sony to soften the assassination scene. I mean, to make it less personally embarrassing to Kim Jong-un. And there was this email exchange we saw between the Sony co-chairman, Amy Pascal, writing to the director of the movie, Seth Rogen. She says, "You have to appreciate the fact that we haven't just dictated to you what it had to be." He writes back, "This is now a story of Americans changing their movie to make North Koreans happy." So stuff was happening within Sony. So those are the two preludes. The attack, we learned about it in December, but it actually started in September. September 2014 is when the attack started. We see now spear phishing attacks against Sony. So these are targeted emails delivering malware to Sony, we don't know who within Sony. They seem to have been undetected by Sony. They were successful. The hackers very quickly obtained administrator credentials, and they spent 3 months systematically mapping the Sony network, downloading files, planning their attack. So these are very careful, very patient attackers. Another side, this happened, and probably unrelated. On November 8th, the United States Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, went on a trip to North Korea. This was a secret meeting to try to orchestrate the release of 2 U.S. prisoners. He had dinner with the chief of North Korea's Reconnaissance Bureau, which is like North Korea's head spy. It seems like this never came up. Clapper didn't know about it. This had nothing to do with Sony. But it did happen, which I think is interesting. So the attack started on November 24th. November 24th is when basically the attackers tried to erase all of Sony's computers. And I mean, think about that for a second. That is an incredibly destructive attack. Not the first time, right? We saw the attacks against Saudi Aramco in, I think, 2011, where the same things happened. You know, here the attacks weren't perfect because when these attacks started, the computers started displaying pictures of skulls and crossbones on their screen. The savvy and smart Sony employees reached back and yanked the power cord immediately, thereby saving a lot of data. Right? Smarter would be to just erase data and not alert the user. Some employees were not at work, computers weren't turned on. Not all the data was lost, a lot of it was lost. And at this time, there was a posting on Reddit from a group calling themselves the Guardians of Peace, taking credit for the attack, talking about more to come, not giving a motive. We know now that within the United States government, work on attributing this attack began immediately. They're trying to figure out who did it. And this is both looking at the attack itself, what data is happening in real time, and what the NSA could learn from whatever eavesdropping operations it has in North Korea. November 26th is the first leak. 4 unreleased movies were released on BitTorrent. And you can look up what they are, and then you can still get them if you want to watch them. The first inkling that North Korea might be involved here was speculated by the press. I think that it is an NBC news story. Is the first time I have found that that's being talked about. The movie The Interview is coming out, possible North Korea. And this is just speculation at this point. On that same day, there was, that's December 1st. On that same day, we saw the first major leak of Sony data, 26 gigabytes, including quite a lot of employee data, employment data, medical data, social security numbers, executive salaries, embarrassing lots of people. And then the leaks would come every few days. December 3rd is the second major leak, 34 gigabytes. A lot of passwords. If you're a company, don't store your passwords in a clear text file marked passwords. Dumb idea. Security alerts, accounting information, payment information. December 7th, a third leak, budgets, financial reports, banking statements, license agreements, employee contracts. This is where we're learning what stars are getting paid what. December 8th, another major leak. This is the 4th if you're keeping track. Here are all the emails. Lots of very embarrassing emails from Sony executives, making fun of the US president, making fun of their stars. On that same day, December 8th, so this is 8 days after that NBC article, the Guardians of Peace release a message linking the attacks to the interview. And I think this is important, that the attackers never mentioned the movie until we all started talking about it. And there's this sentence, I pulled a sentence, "Stop immediately showing the movie of terrorism which can break the regional peace and cause the war." I mean, so the grammar is only okay here. The next day, December 9th, we have the FBI director, the cyber division director, makes a statement. There is no attribution to North Korea at this point. The United States we are not thinking that North Korea is involved. December 10th, 2 more major leaks, entertainment deals in the works, a lot of information about how Sony is dealing with piracy. December 13th, another leak. December 14th, another leak. December 19th. Okay, this is the day that we officially blame North Korea. There's a statement from the FBI, a press release, and it goes on for a bunch of paragraphs. And, I mean, this is sort of the money quote. "As a result of our investigation and in close cooperation with other U.S. government departments and agencies, the FBI has now enough information to conclude that the North Korean government is responsible for these actions." So the U.S. officially blames North Korea. Kind of a big deal. And President Obama makes a public statement about this. Right? We cannot have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States. Now, the thing about this statement, the press release, is that we are actually not given any evidence. And this turns out to be a big deal. Right? There's a couple of sentences talking about similarities in the code between this attack and a 2013 attack that's widely attributed to North Korea. It's called Dark Soul, if you want to look it up. There's some similarities in the networks used, but really very unconvincing. I mean, almost as an afterthought. The FBI statement, alludes very clearly to secret evidence, right? In close collaboration with other U.S. government departments and agencies. Who's that? That's the NSA, right? That's the CIA. I mean, it's pretty clear to me. And it's probable that there is some secret evidence. I mean, we do not know what the NSA has, and we're never going to know. Right? If, in fact, the NSA is in Sony's networks, they might have phone calls discussing the plan. They might have Kim Jong-un's sign-off on the whole project. I mean, we don't actually know. We do know from a New York Times article that was published, I think, a couple of weeks ago, that the U.S. intelligence was partly based on a human source inside Kim Jong-un's office. So what that means, we don't know. Whether that's real, we don't know. But that's something we now know that we didn't know then. This release by the FBI was faced with enormous skepticism in the security community. I mean, it just didn't make sense that North Korea would do this, right? That a government would attack Sony about a movie. I mean, the motive about the movie didn't show up in the Guardians of Peace until the press started talking about it. The best rebuttal is an engineer from Cloudflare. The name is Mark Rogers. You could look up stuff he's written. I mean, very skeptical. Basically, this evidence makes no sense. It is unconvincing. I wrote a skeptical essay. And it's kind of interesting. Sony, oddly enough, has a vested interest in North Korea being the attacker. If you think about their contracts, there's certainly a force majeure clause. So actually having it be a nation-state attack will protect them from some lawsuits. And I'm sure there are a good dozen lawsuits in the works against Sony right now. I mean, if you invested in one of those movies, you'd sue. Right, so we have lots of alternate theories. The most common one at the point is just hackers. Sony has been the victim of hacks for most of a decade. There was a 2005 incident about a Sony rootkit. And they've been a company hackers have loved to hate. and they get repeatedly hacked. And then we see all sorts of other evidence, right? There's some linguistic analysis we saw that implied that there were Russian speakers who were writing those Guardians of Peace missives that would appear on Reddit and other places. The disgruntled insider theory was getting a lot of play. There was a company called Norse Security that claimed they actually found who it could have been. And there's stories that they briefed the FBI. The FBI didn't believe them. This theory sort of disappeared. So it seems like it wasn't true. And there are other theories. Unaffiliated North Korean nationals. We know in China, a lot of the cyber attacks are not perpetrated by the government. They're perpetrated by lone actors who have nationalistic fervor, who, if they find anything good, pass it on to the government. I call this kids playing politics. And we will see it. In China, you'll see it. Israel versus the Arab states. You'll see it India versus Pakistan. We saw it in the Russia versus Estonia, 2006, I believe. Right, that these are just sort of free actors who are, playing politics. Another theory, I talked about this, is hackers recruited by North Korea. Knowingly or unknowingly. Or, and this made the most sense to me, is some kind of blended attack. That there was a conventional hacker attack that was co-opted by North Korea. Right, so the hackers did the hacking and they're doing the releasing, and now North Korea is claiming it's us. Or maybe even just taking over the attack from the hackers. Nobody knows. December 22nd, 23rd, North Korea is attacked. I don't know if you remember this, but North Korea was the victim of the distributed denial of service attack. Again, here we have no idea who did this. The USA quickly denied they were behind the attack. No one else has claimed responsibility, and we've learned nothing since then. It was a garden variety attack. North Korea does not have a very extensive internet. It's pretty easy to take them down. So, a lone hacker could have easily done this. January 2nd, the U.S. government imposed sanctions on North Korea in retaliation. Largely, this is ceremonial. North Korea is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries on the planet. There's not much left to do to them. What's a trade embargo going to do? But this was mainly for show, and the U.S. government did this. Really doubling down on North Korea did this. Next thing that happened is January 7th. We had the FBI director, James Comey. He was speaking at an event in New York at Fordham University, and he was able to talk more about how the FBI knew why North Korea was being accused. And he said that the North Koreans got sloppy. What he basically says is the attackers were very good about covering their tracks. That they would route their attacks through proxies. Some of the leaks came from Taiwan, some came from other countries. Because when these documents are released, we could sort of figure out where were they first released from. They're being released from all over. But what Comey said is that once in a while, the attackers got sloppy and didn't cover their tracks. And in those cases, they came from North Korea. Again, the skeptics weren't convinced. Someone wrote that this definitely means it wasn't the government, because any government system wouldn't allow the users to get sloppy. Right? The system wouldn't work if the tracks weren't covered. Other people said, well, how do you know those were when the tracks were not covered? Maybe these other ones were, and someone routed their attacks through North Korea. And there's actually another good Mark Rogers blog post about this. And then, some more stuff. There are some more data leaks. I'll sort of peter out now, because you've kind of gotten the basic idea here, with the exception of all the really embarrassing things about Sony that have been released. And you're welcome to look those up yourself. So that's the story. Okay, so why is this interesting? I think this is really interesting for a lot of reasons. I mean, this encapsulates many of the themes and some of the surprises of cyber conflict. Right, so what's interesting here? The target was really interesting. And we've spent a lot of time talking about critical infrastructure, how we must defend critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. And by that we mean the power grid, the internet backbone, maybe the air traffic control system. We generally don't mean an entertainment company. Now, yet here we are, the first, one of the early major cyber attacks being attributed to a government is perpetrated against a company that makes movies. Kind of a surprise. I assure you, nobody expected that. The objective here is the objective was not theft. I mean, there was theft, but the really objective was destruction, and if you believe North Korea did it, coercion. Also a surprise. The other reason I think this is interesting is that I think this was very much a wake-up moment for at least U.S. companies. Because really, we are all vulnerable to this sort of thing. And this is not new, right? This is something we've been talking about a lot. The way I think about it is that you can place attackers across two axes. Think of skill and focus. So your low-skill, low-focus attacker are the script kiddies. What I think of as the background radiation of the internet. The thousands of attacks that happen every day, all the phishing emails you get, all the spam, all that stuff. Right, the opportunists, the really low-level things. Right, high skill, low focus, sticking to my two-axis characterization, are identity theft attacks, zero-day exploits. Low skill, high focus, now we're getting to targeted attacks. What this is a high skill, high focus attack. What is commonly called advanced persistent threat. And the key difference between a high skill, high focus and a low skill, low focus, or even a high skill, low focus, is absolute security versus relative security. Traditionally, we in cybersecurity worry about relative security. Think about some of the major breaches in the United States last year. Target, Home Depot. Those were criminal attacks. Those were criminals looking for large blocks of credit card numbers with which to commit fraud. And the criminals actually don't care where they come from. If Target's security is better than another company's, the attackers will go to that other company and spare Target. The Sony attack is different. The attackers wanted Sony. For whatever reason, whatever their motivation was, this was not random, this was not an opportunist, this was a targeted attack. So it actually doesn't matter whether Sony's security is better than another movie studio security. What matters is Sony's security better than the attackers? And right now, in our world, in IT security, attack is much easier than defense. Right? Attackers have the advantage. A sufficiently funded, motivated, skilled attacker will get in, period. If you know anybody who does penetration testing, you know this. Right? They pretty much never fail not to get in. Now, also, in addition to this, Sony actually had some really bad security. It's not just a password file in the clear marked passwords. They actually did have some really lousy IT security. There was information about that in the leaked documents, so we could really see how bad it was. I pulled a quote from 2005. This is Sony's Executive Director of Information Security. And he's talking about the company IT security. And he says, we're trying to remain profitable for our shareholders, and we literally could go broke trying to cover for everything. So you make risk-based decisions. What are the most important things that are absolutely required by law? Turns out, guy, you got to do more than that. Because actually the attackers got in very easily. There's an FBI statement. I couldn't find the quote, but he's basically said that the Sony attack could have been blocked by like 90% of the commercial stuff companies should be buying and using. That the attacks weren't all that skilled. The other reason this is interesting is we're actually having, and you have to think of this for a second. We're having a discussion whether a particular attack was committed by a couple of guys in a basement somewhere or the government of North Korea. It is a weird world where you can't tell the difference between those two. Right? And this is what I think it might be my key point. It's not that we're fighting cyber war. It's that we're increasingly seeing warlike tactics in broader cyber conflicts. The technology is broadly spreading capability. Right? Traditionally, we tell the attacker by the weaponry. You know, if we went outside on one of the main streets here in Leuven and we saw a tank, we would know the Belgian military was involved because they're the only people who have tanks. That trick, that shorthand, doesn't work in cyberspace. Everybody, from lone hackers to nation states, and everyone in between, is using the same tactics, the same weaponry, doing the same stuff. And we've seen this before. I don't know if you remember recently, I think about a month and a half ago, the hacker group Anonymous issued a release that they were going after ISIS. What? Do we have hacker groups going after, major terrorist political movements in countries? I'm reminded in 2010, another branch of Anonymous actually threatened NATO. Like, we're not supposed to be in a world where a couple of guys can credibly threaten NATO. That's wrong on a lot of levels. But we're seeing that. I mean, we saw a few weeks ago that hackers associated with ISIS broke into U.S. military CENTCOM's Twitter and YouTube accounts. So this kids playing politics is becoming very real and very serious and actually affecting politics. Politically motivated hacking is real. And you have to define politics very broadly here. Nationalistic, ethical, religious. We're seeing it against governments, against corporations, against institutions, against individuals. That whole companies hackers love to hate. And the real issue here, what I think that makes this the most interesting, is that it really shows how hard attack attribution is. It is not clear that we can reliably attribute attacks in cyberspace. Very different than the real world. But if someone starts bombing this place, we will know what country did it. If fighter planes fly overhead, we will very quickly figure out who it is. That just doesn't work in the cyber realm. And it's hard to know how much attribution capability there is. In 2012, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, he said, it's an interesting statement. He said publicly that the U.S. has, this is a quote, made significant advances in identifying the origins of cyber attacks. I heard other officials say similarly that we have solved the attribution problem. Not actually, we don't know what that means, because the attribution problem is very, very hard. Figuring out where packets came from the internet is, in many cases, impossible. I actually took Panetta's statement to mean that the NSA is spying on so many networks that we can watch the planning process. This is the idea that we know that North Korea did it because, we saw the attack being planned. We were eavesdropping on their phone calls. Not that we saw the packets come from North Korea. So this problem is hard. And not just for the U.S., for other countries as well. But the U.S. has very unique capabilities in espionage. in cyberspace that many other countries can't duplicate. And for them, attribution is much, much harder. When you think about North Korea trying to figure out who attacked them. I mean, they'll never know, basically. So in addition to attribution being hard, providing evidence for it is even harder. Because the U.S. was in a bind. I believe they believe North Korea did it, and they now have to convince me, us, that North Korea did it. But if their evidence is largely secret, they can't. And there's sort of different flavors of attribution. I mean, sort of here are three different escalations of attribution. I know you did it, right? I know the attack came from you. I can convince you that I know you did it, right? We call up North Korea and say, look, we know it was you and here's how. And separately and entirely convince the public at large that North Korea did it. Right? Making a public statement, I know North Korea did it and here's how I know. And here's what I know. Right? Three very different things. I mean, we could be at a point where we know who did it, but cannot convince anybody else of the fact. For whatever reason, technical or political or sources and methods. And this is hard because the U.S. government expects support for whatever its retaliatory actions are. But if the public is skeptical, and the U.S. public is actually very skeptical of these secret assertions after the whole Iraq weapons of mass destruction debacle. So there's a lot of skepticism when the U.S. government says, we have secret evidence, trust us. Also, attribution takes a while. Right? It took weeks before the U.S. said, we believe North Korea did it. This actually makes response really difficult. Because you might not have weeks to figure out who attacked you. And this is actually a very broad point. In an environment where you don't know who's attacking you, you don't know who's in charge of the defense. So think of it this way. When you're attacked, there are a variety of institutions you can call on for your defense. You can call on the police. You can call on the military. You can call on whoever does counterterrorism in your country. You can call on some commercial products and services. You can call on your corporate lawyers. Right? Those are all valid ways to defend yourself. But the legal framework for your defense depends on two things: who's attacking you and why. And if you think about attacks in cyberspace, not just Sony, any of them, the two things you don't know are who's attacking you and why. So you don't even know what legal regime your defense is operating. It is a very different defense if we are being attacked by a nation state than if we're being attacked by a couple of guys. This makes response very difficult to figure out and pretty much impossible to do quickly. Because you don't know who to respond to, you don't have any confidence that you know, because you have to do the investigation. You have to figure it out. The other thing this incident brought up is that the cyber war rhetoric is real. There was a lot of very strong, we need to attack North Korea back, like physically with bombs and stuff. You know, I have two quotes. Former Speaker of the House in the U.S., Newt Gingrich, called this pure cyber warfare. Senator John McCain, a manifestation of a new form of warfare. There's a lot of hyperbole here, and it really skews debate. But strong attribution leads to deterrence. If you think about the game theory of this, it is really in the U.S.'s best interests to be overconfident about attribution. Because what the U.S. wanted to convey, not really to North Korea, but to everybody else watching, is don't do this, we will know it's you. Right? You cannot hide. We can attribute attacks. If you try it, we'll know it's you. Right? A very strong message to every country in the world. Don't do this sort of stuff. Right? So sort of speaking your rhetoric of we've solved the attribution problem, it's hard for you, but we can figure it out, is a very powerful diplomatic statement. Right? So this could easily be an overconfident U.S. attribution. Other things we have to think about, and we've been talking about, but now to think about it for real. Right? Who secures critical infrastructure? I mean, this is Sony. What if the next time it's the power grid? Power, communications, transportation, chemical plants. There's lots of cyber infrastructure that is potentially very damaging. And we don't have clear rules on who gets to secure it. And we have serious market failures here. Right? The market will not secure these networks to their true value to society. Right? Basically, the market doesn't value them to all those externalities overflow. So do you need regulation? Do you need subsidies for security? Do you need government takeover? Right? And different ones work in different places. We tend to use regulation of things like chemical plants. We use government takeover for airline security in the United States. We use subsidies in other places. What works here? We haven't really talked about it. And we need to really think about the characteristics of these cyber attacks and eventual cyber war. I mean, there's a really interesting asymmetry here. If you think of U.S. versus North Korea, the U.S. is extraordinarily vulnerable to cyber attacks. North Korea is basically immune because they don't really have any cyberspace. There is this natural terrain that we have to start thinking about. And this asymmetry between attacker and defender, that attack is easier. And this difficulty of fast attribution, that weapons don't come with a return address. If you think about nuclear deterrence, it was all based on the fact that if one side launched the missiles, the other side would know who did it before they came down and could retaliate. Right? The speed of attribution was critical in all of those, crazy mutually assured destruction scenarios. I think this incident really pushes the fact that we need cyber war treaties, that we need international discussions about what types of attacks are legitimate and what are illegitimate. Are there things we can ban as a group of countries? I mean, I could make up things: no first use, minimizing collateral damage, no attacks against civilian targets or infrastructure, no unaimed weapons. So a lot of things to think about here. What are the rules of engagement for cyber war? I mean, can we have some equivalent of uniforms? I think non-attribution is actually very dangerous. Not because you just don't know who did it, because it's easy to false flag. It's relatively easy to route your attack through another country and blame them. I actually believe that many cyber attacks, espionage attacks that are conducted by Western countries go through China. Because everyone knows China is the source of a lot of cyber attacks. So if I was the NSA, I'd do that. Right? We need to understand a lot of these things. And we need to rebuild resilience into our infrastructure. One of the things the Sony attack really brought home is the importance of resilience. That if you are not resilient to these attacks, you are not doing your job. It isn't what that guy said in 2005 of doing the bare minimum required by law. And that just doesn't cut it. We actually need some resilient security here. And these attacks are rare, but they're going to happen again. This is not going to be the last one. We know that in, I think it was 2010, H.B. Gary was really the first major this sort of attack, right? And these were hackers associated with Anonymous who went into the company and exposed emails, financial information, basically all their company's secrets. So this kind of thing does happen. I mean, how do you build resilience against that? Unfortunately, we are now in the early years of a cyber war arms race. There's a lot of cyber war rhetoric out there. Right? US, China, Russia, UK, lesser extent France, Germany, Israel, India, Pakistan. I mean, sort of the big countries that have big military budgets. I mean, you can read, since Snowden published it, the U.S. Presidential Decision Directive 20, worth reading. These are the high-level U.S. plans of cyber war. And they direct the military to draw up a list of targets and create weapons designed for those targets. I mean, very much like nuclear readiness. And presumably other countries doing the same thing. Right? We pretty much know China is doing that. I'm pretty confident Russia's doing that. And there's a lot of fear rhetoric. I mean, I gave you 2 quotes related on Sony. I can give you 20 more in general about cyber war and cyber Pearl Harbor and cyber 9/11 and cyber Armageddon. And these are actual quotes by officials. Cyber Katrina, that's another one. That was one of our big hurricanes. Right? So the fear metaphors are great here. But the issues are really important. And we really need to think about how this sort of conflict looks in the 21st century, whether it is a nation state or it is a couple of guys. I mean, these are threats that are different than the standard criminal threat. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Or not. All right, there's someone running up on stage with 2 microphones, which he will put in the hands of people who want to ask questions.
So what's your opinion on this legislation? If we need these kind of cyber war treaties, there's legislation in the Netherlands, for example, that allows for the officials in the police to actually start hacking any computerized objects either in the Netherlands or outside of the Netherlands. And this is something that's being affected into law in order to allow this.
And not just Netherlands, Germany has actually done hacking outside of law. UK, US, we've learned recently that there's an enormous amount of hacking. The NSA does, the FBI does hacking too. I have very mixed feelings about it. Targeted attacks, like hacking into the North Korean networks, seem like a good idea, right? They're certainly much better than breaking iPhone security, leaving all of us insecure. That it does seem like the least worst thing governments can do to get at both criminal information and national intelligence information. I want there to be the rule of law here. And whether in the US it's the FISA court, the UK has their own, much less oversight. But what we're learning from the NSA documents is there's a lot of hacking against innocents to get at other data. So do we want, there's a presentation that in the NSA, they were just hacking sysadmins from random companies and keeping that access in case they needed it later. That feels wrong. It's very different than, we know who you are. You are either a wanted criminal or you are a known foreign leader, and we're going to hack you. There was that whole, it was scandal that the U.S. was hacking Angela Merkel's cell phone. To me, that felt very, isn't that what we're supposed to do, hack foreign leaders? It's the rest of the German population I had a lot more sympathy for, right? Who weren't in charge of the country, who were being hacked. So, and people have written about this, and I do believe that a lot of what the NSA does is via hacking. Is this, we hack the South Korean network, and we're eavesdropping on North Korea that way. that kind of stuff happens a lot. Right? We knew from another document that the NSA intercepted Cisco routers that were destined for the Syrian phone company. I actually think that's kind of okay. I mean, U.S. spies on Syria should not surprise anybody. You know, if we could hack into their phone equipment and get good intelligence, that seems like a good thing. Again, very different than we're going to break all Cisco routers sold everywhere so that nobody's as secure. So the more targeted the attacks are, the happier I am with them. But I think the problem we have here is sort of runaway surveillance without oversight, at least in the United States. I see a hand there, a hand there. I see a hand pointing at a hand.
We also, of course, in Belgium, live thinking about what happened at Sony, and because it's such a big case. One of the things that struck us when we were reviewing all the kind of information that's in the media is that the fact that, well, first of all, how on earth can you not noticing terabytes of data getting out of your network?
You're a movie company. You're moving terabytes all the time. Yeah, they had really bad security. They had really bad security. You just have to accept that.
One of the things that really struck us in 2011, they had a PlayStation event, and they promised the Sony president sent a letter to the American Congress with an action plan. And it's really funny because he promised a lot of things, including technical details, which is kind of funny. And if you look at the evidence now, none of it was implemented. So I'm not sure if you think that going to be scot-free eluding lawsuits by sticking to them.
Yeah, and the PlayStation, I mean, didn't put that in my timeline, but there's an unrelated PlayStation attack in the middle of this, this major attack. So not only did it not do anything, but Sony really has been a company that's been a target. And, you know, it's Sony Pictures, Sony Entertainment. The actual Sony empire is much more complicated than I made it, but the hackers don't know what's what. I mean, Sony's Sony. Now, you wave if you have the microphone. There you are.
With regard to the treaties, last year I spoke with Professor Demchak, and she was actually kind of suggesting that first you almost have to have the kind of digital Westphalia, that is, how to define the digital nation state, because actually what's a territory, the digital territory of a nation state. So to what extent do you see that perhaps as a first need, how to define a country digitally?
And you're right, that's actually very hard. The notion of borders in cyberspace is not the same as the borders in the real world. I mean, at some level they are, I mean, because all computers exist somewhere, but another level they're not. I mean, there's a major case going on in the United States right now where the FBI went to Microsoft and said, turn over data on one of your users, and Microsoft said, the data is in Dublin, talk to the Irish government. You know, right? There's no U.S., and the FBI said, nope, you're a U.S. company, give us the data. And this is being litigated. And it's going to be a very complicated litigation because exactly where sovereignty, how sovereignty flows here is not at all clear. So this is data a U.S. company has about a non-U.S. person in a non-U.S. subsidiary's computers. Whose law wins? You know, we see that, we're seeing that even something as easy as tariffs and trade, as more individuals and small companies sell things on eBay and Etsy. You know, whose law takes precedence? Whose consumer protection laws? And there's a lot of stuff going to happen here. So yes, the borders, sovereignty, whose laws apply, big issues. And there are going to be, I think, some very, very complicated international legal decisions, discussions about this. Now, we're seeing some of this in the right to be forgotten here in Europe. Some of this in, you know, the laws in France against Nazi paraphernalia. Some of the laws in censorship laws, laws against sex toys and porn. You got to wave. I don't know who you are. Oh, there you are. You know, a lot of it's going to bite the U.S. because, yes, we are one of the major perpetrators of espionage and attack in cyberspace. Right, U.S. fired, as you said, Stuxnet. U.S. actually fired the first nation-state cyber weapon. Right, U.S. and Israel against Iran. So it is kind of hard for us to complain that this should be a weapon-free zone because we're not making it. And I mean, certainly the NSA's actions have made it much harder for us to criticize China. But it's interesting that in some ways, at least in the Sony story, the Snowden documents helped. Because the Snowden documents, if you are a country and you start reading the Snowden documents, your first thought is, uh-oh, the U.S. knows what I'm doing. So there's this weird deterrence effect from this forced publicity that would have never happened another way. So yeah, I do think that we are definitely taking a major hit, we being the U.S., in credibility when we talk about other countries not attacking in cyberspace. But we're also looking really, really buff that we can do all these pretty cool things for a bunch of reasons, right? Because the fact that we spend an enormous amount of money on this, the fact that we have because of the way the network is built, have a very privileged position of what we can see. And those are things that would never become public any other way. Now, I'm sure no U.S. official will say, well, thank heavens the Snowden stories, because now everyone's scared of us. But then I think some of that's going on as well. Right.
Yeah, Benoit Dupont from Montreal. I get your point about treaties. And treaties usually cover conflict situations. But to my knowledge, I might be wrong, but intelligence operations and espionage are never covered by treaties because actually that they are there to get around the limitations of international treaties and so on. So we are in a situation that you described now where you can do espionage at the scale of surveillance. So how do you see that we are going to be able to regulate not conflict, because conflict is a separate problem, but mass espionage, mass surveillance, as we've seen, and we're going to be seeing much more of in the near future? So
I don't know, but what we're seeing from the Snowden documents, from stuff we know China does, or know Russia does, is that this line between espionage and attack is very blurry. That the NSA is not putting up antennas and receiving the information passively. It's breaking into servers and dinking with the code to route the data in places it can get. So we're seeing a lot of attack to facilitate and the term the NSA uses is exfiltration, stealing of data, which is what the Sony attackers did. Was that espionage? Well, they just stole everything, but they broke into the networks to do it. And this is a blurry line that we really don't have rules of engagement for. What counts as espionage and legitimate in peacetime and not covered by treaties, and what counts as attack? Right? If the United States woke up tomorrow and found that the Chinese broke into their military networks, changed everything around, and grabbed all the data, would we say, well, that's just espionage, no worries? We'd probably think we were attacked. So I don't know where the treaty line is, but I know it's not clear and it's changing, which is one of the reasons I want these discussions, because we need to figure this out. So I see two signs here. No one's holding it up. I'm going to hold this one up.
With regarding treaties, it is of interest. You mentioned uniforms, and actually the Treaty of Geneva makes a clear distinction between uniformed soldiers and indeed franc-tireurs. People are actually doing this on their own initiative. So that becomes an additional problem, because you can almost have a treaty and say that's a soldier, but you have to be able to recognize this is a soldier, and usually it's by uniform. So
100% right. The fact that cyber weapons don't have uniforms, they don't have your flag painted on the back of your tank or your plane, is a big deal. It's an enormous deal, especially when it takes 3 weeks to figure out who did it. I mean, it's not going to work well if someone drives an army into your country and it takes you 3 weeks to figure out which country is attacking you. I mean, we're not equipped to deal with that. But yes, you're right. That is the world where we're going into, and that's very, very hard. I come with you not with answers, but with problems. It's interesting. I think the biggest risks is that it gets away from us. Arms races are fueled by two things: by ignorance and fear. And when we're now doing these things in cyberspace without rules, without knowing what the other countries are doing, the risk is that something happens and it gets away. That little things turn into big things, turn into real wars. And I'm scared of that. That a lot of these decisions on what actions are done are being made at very low levels within countries. That the U.S. president isn't signing off on all these operations. And maybe he should. So that's my worry.
Yeah. Next question. This might sound stupid, but why don't governments agree to actually sign their attacks? Because if you know North Korea is attacking you, it makes things much clearer. You know that it's not a rogue attack by some kids playing in a basement. Why don't you, if you want to attack, it's something you are communicating to the other group. So why don't you just sign?
I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, and you could see a treaty saying that weapons have to be signed, that we're not going to allow that. I mean, certainly I think there's a lot of back-channel conversation between... I think if there was a major cyber attack coming from Russia to the United States, the U.S. could call up Russia and say, look, is that really you? And Russia would say, no, that's not us. It's some guy. We don't know. Help. We're really sorry. We're trying to stop it too. Even that communication would be valuable. I don't know. I think there's value in false flagging. Stuxnet's an interesting example. Right? Iran was attacked, but it was about a year before the U.S. finally admitted it. Now, did the U.S. secretly call up Iran and say, that was us, right? We're not going to tell anybody else, but that was us. We're watching you. I don't know. Maybe. My worry is there's perceived value in this anonymity or in blaming some third party. But yes, I think figuring out uniforms would be really useful here. So I think we're out of time. So a couple things I want to say before I get off stage. I am signing books at the Beer Cafe, which is like that way and upstairs. So please come and say hi. I have a book coming out in like 3 weeks, which I couldn't have with me because it's not published yet, on a lot of these issues. It is called Data and Goliath, and it's about surveillance and attack in cyberspace, nation states, non-nation states. So I sort of urge you to get that if you want to hear more about these issues. I will be at the cafe for like an hour, so I'm happy to talk more. Thank you very much, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you very much.